Let's talk about the first step towards self improvement, how to get into that habit, how to feel better about yourself or your life. There is one big step that doesn't get talked about enough, but it's so powerful. And the best thing about it is it's something you can fairly easily do and do regularly that doesn't require the same amount of energy as willpower. So, we're going to get into what that first step is, how you can do it, and why it makes such a big difference in your life. First off, let's talk about why willpower is not the thing that you want to rely on. So, when you think about willpower, we know it is a finite resource. There's just a little bit. It runs out. It's dependent a lot of times on how well is our life going, what's our personal level of energy, how bad do we want something. There's so many variables. It's very difficult to depend on. If you really want an image, it's like climbing a ladder. So, you've got this goal, your improvement and you have to climb this really high vertical ladder. And at some point, you are going to get tired. You are going to get exhausted because the amount of energy to keep going up is so high. But what if there was another way? This is where we move into identity based behavior change. And I'll talk about what the one step is within that makes a really big difference. But just so you know why identity based behavior change, why does that make the difference? It's kind of like an elevator. Okay. So you were using a ladder before to reach your goals. But now, instead of all that effort, you can just press the button and go up. And even on the bad days when you go down a few levels or all the way to the basement, you press that button and again, you get back up there. Because the difference is this: when we're looking at willpower and motivation, essentially the same thing in the standpoint of behavior change or getting a habit. When you look at those, they are so much based on the reward system in your brain. So, if I achieve this part of my goal or my mini goal, let's say you want to start running and you go outside and you do that first run, your reward system kicks in, you get dopamine, you feel great, you did this, ready for the next one. And for anyone that's done any 30, 60, 90-day programs, you know the amount of energy and motivation you feel in the beginning is so high. And every time you hit one of those milestones, it's even better. That's the dopamine coming in. But as we know, it doesn't keep going forever. Okay? It's not always there. And so what happens when you hit day 30, 60, 70, whatever, and it's no longer so exciting to go on the run, or life gets in the way, or a breakup happens, or whatever it is, it gets so much harder for you to put on those running shoes and go outside. But if we're shifting to more of an identity based behavior change, so if you get to the point where you feel like you are the runner, you are a runner, that's what you do, then you will naturally gravitate towards doing those actions. You will do them. And the reason why is fascinating. So there's a whole amount of behavior science behind this that we're going to talk about, but essentially it becomes almost mentally painful for you to not follow through on these habits when they're part of your identity. But on the other side of that, the reason why it's so hard to change your habits or the way you act or the way you think is because those bad habits in quotation marks, I'm not saying they necessarily are horrible or bad, but the ones you want to change are linked to the identity you have now. And that's why it's so hard to shift out of it. Now, I'm going to give you an example for me. I've been in the fitness world, wellness world for now it's 21 years, long time. But I was not an athletic person growing up. I was really bad. If you've listened to these episodes enough, you know I was quite literally the last child picked on any teams People were really not happy to have me on them. I dreaded gym class. I would pretend to be sick sometimes. I would do whatever I could, fake an injury, because I was so unathletic, so uncoordinated, always the worst person that I just didn't want to do that. And what changed for me, and I remember this so vividly, is that I was about 17 and I was feeling so frustrated with my life and with the way that I felt in my body. And I just felt completely not good. And you have all these hormones pouring in. And I remember having this thought that, and I told my mom this, that if I could apply how good I was with school, because I was really studious, always trying to get the A's, overachiever type, I thought if I could apply that to fitness, I could be really strong. I could be very much into it. And I started shifting my identity towards that as someone who does value fitness and does value health. And I was able to achieve that. And now it's been 21 years. But I remember that first run when I made that decision and how hard that was. And for several months, there was this, "Ugh, do I really want to do this?" But it came from shifting the identity. And it also came from this one very big step that we're going to talk about. The biggest way to kind of cheat the system and really make new habits stick is think about something you are already really good at. What is something that comes naturally to you that might seem harder for someone else? And it can be anything, it can be the smallest, tiny thing, but what are you really good at? Now think about why you're so good at that. What got you to that level? Do you associate any identity with that? So, for example, if you're a really good writer, that's part of your identity. But think about it for a minute. Hold on to that through the episode because we are going to use some of that habit and identity formation to transplant it on what you're trying to do now. To understand how we shift and really evolve in personal development, to understand why it makes such a big difference with habits and why it's so difficult is to really understand how they get started in the first place. Quick way for your brain to respond in an environment. It's a survival mechanism. So instead of using all of this energy and power to think about my next step or my reaction, because we take thousands of choices a day, my mind is just going to form a habit, trigger, response. And that's great when it's something I want to do. So, for example, if I want to exercise more and I get a trigger for I'm feeling low energy or I'm not feeling super happy about life or whatever it is, trigger, let me go exercise. I know that that helps me feel good. The trigger that's not so helpful, that makes it more difficult, is trigger, I don't feel comfortable, I'm going to quit. The one first step towards personal development, the one thing that will make the biggest difference for you, whether you want to do fitness, whether you want to do something in your career, whether you want to be more open minded, more extroverted, whatever the goal is, this one thing makes the difference, and it is self integrity. It is the alignment between your values and your actions, what you say you will do. If I have self integrity and I really trust myself to follow through on stuff, I really believe in myself, that self efficacy, I know that I can do something, I know that I will do it, it'll be much easier for me to take on something new. It'll be much easier for me to fight for a habit even when someone else might be discouraging me, saying, "Who are you to be the runner?" or "Why do you care about what you're eating?" All these things, I can build up more resistance because I have this self integrity. The most fascinating thing about changing behavior and using self integrity to really get you there, to take you to what you want to do, is this idea of cognitive dissonance. And we've talked about it before. It is this mental discomfort you will feel. Sometimes it can be even physical. in the belly or tension in the body when your beliefs and actions are contradictory or inconsistent. So if you believe one thing but you act against it, you will feel that mental discomfort. You will feel a separation. This is why if you're in a job you really hate, it doesn't align with your values. I'm raising my hands here. I've had those. It's going to be hard for you every day to show up. You're thinking like, how does this relate back to identity? How does this relate back to self-improvement? It's if I become a person that follows through on my actions, who keeps my promises to myself, therefore I will have less discomfort. I will have more motivation to continue forward, and I will associate this action with my identity. So if I say that I'm a runner and I feel that identity and it is something that really defines me, it's a value I have to be more into fitness, my actions will need to support that. And that's what the self integrity will do. And to give you an example of how transformative this can be and how motivating it can be when you really start to value self integrity, when you keep those promises to yourself, when you keep those boundaries that you set, it can empower you to do things that you would have thought so impossible. A big example for me that I've shared here before is that I always wanted to be the person that explored things, that went for adventure, that was open to really travel and all of these things. And I found myself very early and quickly after graduating from university in this job that did not allow that stuff. And I actually turned down an opportunity to travel and explore in Malaga, Spain, because I felt this pressure of what's going to be on my resume if I take this time off. What are people going to think? And that decision was so difficult to make, and it created so much mental discomfort in the following months that I ended up going and buying a ticket to Europe and then quitting my job a few months later. That's not something I probably would have ever thought that I would have done at that time. But because there was so much misalignment between my values and my actions, it motivated me to go forward. That would not have been possible if I hadn't had self integrity from the past, if I hadn't kept my promises to myself, if I hadn't followed through on actions I said I would do. I wouldn't have been able to take that step. Same thing with launching a business, same thing with moving country, same thing with any big decision you make, entering a relationship. You need this self integrity. And so, this is where I would invite you to look at your life and see what is a big promise that I have kept to myself? What's something I've valued so much and I've made sure I've done it? No matter what has come, what have I said I would do? I guarantee you have one thing, and you should really feel pride of having that. You should feel grateful that you have maintained that, because I'm sure it wasn't easy. Now, I want you to take a step into discomfort here and think about a promise or an action that you value or you want to value that you haven't followed through on. What's something that is the promise or the boundary or the thing that you keep on breaking? That's what you want to start with. And interestingly, the biggest promise to yourself that you're breaking is not necessarily the biggest habit that you want. So maybe the biggest habit you want is to exercise more, but actually the biggest promise that you're breaking is not giving yourself enough energy, time, and attention, always saying yes to other people. The focus is not first on the exercise. The focus is on honoring that promise, because that will then help you make other promises, like I'm going to go to the gym, like I'm going to do whatever. Because when you do that, it becomes so natural. It's really funny for me to think about this, because when I started running, I don't run now, but for a little time I tried. But when I started running, it was really hard for me to just run down the street because I was not an athletic person. I didn't define myself that way. And in the beginning, it was very much for me just about losing weight. And it was for many years. And every single time, there was a lot of mental energy required to maintain those habits. When that shifted and it became, I've done fitness for so long that I just really feel it's a part of my life, it's a part of who I am, it didn't require so much energy to do the things. To the point now, it's so natural and effortless to do this. I mean, of course, you still have days where you think, I don't want to work out. I don't want to eat this food. And sometimes you don't. But the majority of the times, I will keep those promises. I will follow through on them. I will do those things and I will feel motivated. There's that motivation, but in a different way to follow through. Now, if you're sitting here wondering, okay, how do I actually do this? It sounds good in theory. I like the idea of following through on my promises, but I don't really know where to begin. Now, we've already started with what's the biggest promise that you've broken, because that's the one to start with. But before you even go into that, it's looking at what are your core values? What is the value that you've broken in that promise? What is the thing you said you would do that you didn't? For me, when I didn't go and do this exploration that I had always promised I would, the value was freedom, the value was adventure, the value was being really open to a different way of life. That was the value that I was breaking. So, what's the value for you? And there's probably something that pops up in your mind. That's what you want to hold on to. The next step is consistency through self concept. And all that means is you're going to consistently take actions that support that value. And they can be tiny to start. So if I were to go back and look at this value I had of freedom and travel and seeing the world, a baby step I might have taken would have been something like, I'm going to entertain the idea of looking at trips. I don't have to commit to that yet, but I can look. And in fact, in the beginning, that's what I did. You know, when I would have downtime in my job, I would just be searching trips to Europe. And I don't think at that time I really believed that I would book it or quit, but it was just a baby step. And the more I got involved in it, the more I started thinking about it, taking that next consistent action, the harder it became to say no, to not do it. And then the last one is hold yourself accountable. If you say you're going to do this thing, do it. It doesn't mean that it needs to be today, but it needs to be at some point. Hold yourself accountable for actions that you don't think you can really put a deadline on. You feel as if, I'm not sure, life is really up in the air right now. That's okay. But be honest about that. Don't say, I'm going to do this tomorrow if it's so unlikely that it's going to happen. When I think about how busy my day is going to be tomorrow, for example, I will look at the reality of me actually going and working out. Now, usually I try to still do it, but if I'm thinking it's been a long week, there's so much happening, I'm probably not going to do it. I'm not going to say that I am. If I do, that's great. If I don't, I'm not in contradiction with my value majority of the time. And so this is just defining those values, consistently taking those actions, and really holding yourself accountable for them. And if you haven't held yourself accountable to promises for yourself for a long time, you can start today. You can start with something small. When we look at the stages of behavior change and developing personally and evolving, there's always the interesting step that people kind of skip or they think doesn't matter. They are doing all the research. And it feels like this is not part of the action, but it is. Because once you have all this information in front of you, you've done these consistent actions, you've held yourself accountable, that's when you take the big one. So if that's where you're at right now, that is a huge leap. And if you haven't gotten there yet, you start with that one. Self-integrity is the biggest step towards personal development. It's something that doesn't have a sexy name or a catchphrase, but it is the most powerful tool you can use to really change in your life. It is the thing that will power you through way more than willpower. Going back to two things now as we wrap up. First is remember that thing I asked you, what are you really good at? What are you always associating with your identity. Remember that? How can you use whatever it took to get to that point towards this new habit, goal, or promise that you broke or you don't want to break any longer? How can you do that? To give you a small tip here, when I was looking at something I was really good at, which was studying, and something I wasn't, which was fitness, the promise I kept breaking of not being active, when I was looking at those two things, what did it for me was with studying, I am planning and I am consistent. I will always set aside time in my schedule to study. I'm going to now do that with fitness. And to this day, that is something I do. On my calendar with all the work appointments, there is always the workout. So, looking at what has made you great at the thing that you excel at, the thing you're so good at, and how can you apply it to this new, unfamiliar next step. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this episode helpful or any of the other ones, please leave a review. Mention what was most helpful because I want to make sure that I continue to produce shows that help you. And every time you leave a review, I can really see like what is making the difference and expands more on that, as well as guests you might want to see. And I will see you in the next one.